This was not removed because it was wrong. It was removed because it could not coexist with the rest. The chapter that was removed from the original manuscript, a fragment that was never meant to survive. Prologue: why this chapter could not remain. This chapter was not removed because it was wrong. It was removed because it changed the behavior of those who read it, not emotionally, not spiritually, functionally. Readers did not feel inspired. They did not feel empowered. They did not feel enlightened. They became quiet. Urgency disappeared. Desire softened. The need to prove, chase, or become dissolved. And that was the problem. The original manuscript was built to guide, explain, and structure understanding. This chapter did something else. It interrupted the process entirely. After reading it, people stopped asking how, stopped asking when, stopped asking what comes next. They did not abandon their lives, but they no longer moved from the same place. The chapter could not coexist with the rest of the manuscript, not because it contradicted it, but because once read, the rest stopped working the same way. That is why this fragment was removed, and why it only survives now, isolated. If you continue, do not expect motivation. This chapter does not add anything to you. It removes something. And once it does, there is no way to put it back. Section Y, the contradiction. The original manuscript was coherent. Every principle supported the next. Every mechanism led somewhere. Every explanation preserved movement. Progress was the spine of the text. This chapter broke that spine. Not violently, subtly. At first, no one noticed. The contradiction did not appear as disagreement. It appeared as a pause. The manuscript taught alignment as movement. You adjusted, you refined, you progressed, and reality responded. Time collapsed, outcomes accelerated, identity reorganized. Everything pointed forward. This chapter introduced a state where nothing pointed anywhere, and yet everything still functioned. That was the contradiction. Readers began reporting something unusual. They finished the chapter and did not feel compelled to continue, not bored, not confused, complete. The rest of the manuscript still made sense intellectually, but it no longer felt necessary. That was when concern emerged. A book designed to guide, explain, and structure understanding cannot contain a section that ends seeking. The manuscript relied on tension, between who you are and who you are becoming, between now and next, between lack and fulfillment. This chapter dissolved tension, not by answering questions, but by making the questions irrelevant. Desire did not disappear. It simply lost urgency, and urgency was the engine. At first, the scribes attempted to frame the fragment as an advanced section, a final revelation, a hidden appendix. But the effect was always the same. Once encountered, the rest of the material became inert. Practices felt mechanical, goals felt theatrical, language felt unnecessary. The manuscript could not survive this internally. A system cannot teach movement while containing stillness that ends movement. The contradiction was not philosophical. It was operational. The manuscript said that understanding more would lead to better movement. This chapter created a state where understanding stopped generating momentum. There was no seeking, no chasing, no refinement, not stagnation. Neutrality. Neutrality was the threat. Neutrality does not build systems. It does not scale, organize people, or propagate doctrine. Neutral individuals are not disruptive. They are uncontrollable. They do not rebel. They simply do not participate in unnecessary movement. What unsettled the keepers most was that readers did not argue, reject, or denounce the manuscript. They did not resist. They simply stopped using it, quietly, without explanation, without opposition. That silence spread faster than disagreement ever could. On the surface, the chapter used the same language, the same tone, the same authority. But internally, it introduced an exit, not from the book, but from the need for the book. At that point, removal became inevitable. A lie can be corrected. A contradiction destabilizes everything around it. The manuscript could be debated. This chapter could not. It did not argue. It neutralized. The chapter did not contradict the manuscript's teachings. It contradicted the manuscript's purpose, and purpose is non-negotiable. So the chapter was extracted, not destroyed, contained. What you are reading now is not an explanation. It is the residue of a fracture, a fragment that could not remain embedded, not because it was false, but because it worked in the opposite direction of instruction. If a single chapter can make the rest unnecessary, what does that say about the rest? That question was never meant to be asked. This section ends here because explanation would reintroduce movement, and movement is what this chapter interrupts. What comes next does not explain further. It reveals the missing mechanism that made this contradiction irreversible. And once seen, it becomes clear why this chapter was never meant to exist inside a complete book. Only as a fragment, only once. Section 2. The missing mechanism. What the original manuscript never named was not a principle, a law, or a technique. It was a mechanism that operated independently of desire, intention, belief, or identity. It did not require focus. It did not respond to will. It did not accelerate through effort. It functioned whether the reader wanted it to or not. That was the missing mechanism. Unlike everything else in the manuscript, this mechanism did not depend on becoming someone, aligning with something, or correcting an internal state. It did not reward clarity. It did not punish incoherence. It simply activated when a certain threshold of saturation was crossed. Not saturation of emotion, but saturation of seeking. The manuscript taught movement toward. This mechanism emerged when movement stopped. Readers did not activate it deliberately. In fact, the more deliberately they tried, the less it appeared. It surfaced only when the system was exhausted from trying to improve itself, fix itself, optimize itself, or transcend itself. When the internal narrative ran out of momentum, something else took over. This is where the danger appeared, because the mechanism did not improve life in the traditional sense. It did not create ambition. It did not generate goals. It did not offer visions of the future. It removed the internal pressure that made those things necessary. And once that pressure dissolved, behavior changed without intention. People still worked, still spoke, still lived, but their movement no longer originated from lack, and systems are built entirely on lack-based motion. Without lack, persuasion fails. Without lack, urgency collapses. Without lack, external direction loses leverage. The manuscript was designed to help people move better within the structure of desire. This mechanism dismantled the structure altogether, not aggressively, invisibly. Those who encountered it did not become passive. They became unresponsive to artificial motivation. Incentives stopped working, threats lost relevance, comparison dissolved, not through insight, but through absence. The most unsettling part was that the mechanism could not be explained without weakening its effect. Explanation reintroduced interpretation. Interpretation reactivated identity. Identity reactivated seeking, and seeking shut the mechanism down. So the scribes stopped trying to explain it. They observed instead. They noticed that after this mechanism activated, people stopped narrating their lives. They stopped framing experiences as lessons, steps, or progressions. Events still happened, but meaning no longer accumulated around them. Without accumulated meaning, identity thinned. Without identity, acceleration lost its reference point. This is why the chapter could not remain. The manuscript depended on identity refinement. This mechanism dissolved identity density. It did not destroy the self. It made it porous, and porous identities cannot be guided. What frightened the keepers most was not collapse. It was stability of a different kind, a quiet, non-reactive stability that could not be steered. No ideology could anchor it. No practice could maintain it. No authority could claim it. Once the mechanism appeared, the manuscript's instructions became optional. Not wrong, optional. And optional knowledge does not survive inside structured systems. So the chapter was removed before the mechanism could spread without context. Because if too many people stopped moving from lack at the same time, entire frameworks would lose momentum. Not governments, not religions, subtler systems, productivity, aspiration, social pacing, the invisible machinery that keeps things advancing, whether or not advancement is needed. The chapter was not erased to protect readers. It was erased to protect continuity. And what you are reading now is the trace left behind by something that could not be preserved without dissolving the very structure that held it. What comes next does not explain the mechanism further. It documents what happened when it appeared anyway. The effects that could be observed but never fully described, the lives that did not collapse but quietly rearranged themselves without narrative, without announcement, without return. That is where the manuscript stopped trying to teach and started trying to contain. Section 3. The effect observed, never explained. What followed the appearance of the mechanism could not be taught, only observed. There were no instructions to record, no practices to formalize, no language precise enough to capture what changed. The effects did not present themselves as transformation. They appeared as disappearance, not of people, but of patterns. Those who encountered it did not abandon their lives. They did not retreat into isolation or renounce the world. On the surface, nothing dramatic occurred. Careers continued, relationships remained, responsibilities were fulfilled. But internally, something fundamental disengaged. They stopped orienting themselves around outcomes. Not because outcomes failed to arrive, but because outcomes no longer anchored behavior. Action continued without anticipation. Decisions occurred without internal negotiation. The future lost its gravitational pull. What replaced it was not presence in the romantic sense, but neutrality without effort. Observers struggled to describe this state. It was not detachment. It was not apathy. It was not enlightenment. It was an absence of internal friction, a lack of commentary between impulse and action, movement without story. This was deeply unsettling to those who relied on narrative to track progress. Without visible striving, it became impossible to tell whether someone was advancing, regressing, or standing still. And systems depend on legibility. They require people to be readable. Those affected became unreadable. They still responded, but not predictably. Praise no longer increased performance. Criticism no longer corrected behavior. Incentives lost precision. Fear lost timing. What remained was a form of internal sufficiency that did not require reinforcement. Some were mistaken for having lost ambition. Others were accused of hiding something. A few were labeled unstable. None of these descriptions held because nothing was missing. Something had simply stopped being necessary. One of the most documented effects was the collapse of comparative behavior. Without internal pressure, comparisons ceased to function. Not through discipline, but through irrelevance. Others' achievements did not provoke inferiority or aspiration. They registered and passed. This made social synchronization difficult. Conversations about goals, plans, and future positioning lost traction. Those affected did not oppose such discussions. They simply did not participate in them internally. Words were exchanged. Energy was not. The most concerning observation was how quickly this state stabilized. There was no oscillation, No honeymoon period, no regression. Once the internal pressure dissolved, it did not return. Attempts to reintroduce urgency through stimulation, fear or reward produced no lasting effect. The mechanism did not liberate people from responsibility. It liberated them from compulsion. Responsibility remained. Obligation did not. This distinction confused nearly everyone. Without compulsion, actions became precise, fewer but exact. Decisions were made late, but cleanly. When movement occurred, it was irreversible. There was no rehearsal, no justification, no need to explain. This created a pattern that could not be integrated into existing frameworks. Progress without narrative could not be tracked. Stability without identity could not be categorized. A life without visible striving could not be evaluated. And evaluation is how systems maintain coherence. What disturbed the keepers most was that the mechanism did not spread through teaching. It spread through proximity, not by imitation, but by resonance. People who spent extended time near those affected began to exhibit similar disengagement from urgency. Not immediately, subtly. They still wanted things, but wanting lost its edge. This raised an unanswerable question. If this state propagated without instruction, how could it be contained? The answer was simple. It couldn't. So the only remaining option was invisibility. The chapter that described the mechanism was removed. Language was restricted. Documentation stopped. What could not be eliminated was diluted through silence. Those who encountered it were not punished. They were left alone. And over time, they stopped appearing in records. Not because they vanished, but because they no longer generated traceable momentum. No peaks, no collapses, no stories worth recording. They became administratively invisible. That was the final confirmation. A mechanism that produces people who cannot be categorized, accelerated, corrected, or motivated cannot coexist with any system built on progression. So the manuscript continued, without the chapter. And the chapter continued, without the manuscript. What remains now is not an explanation of effects, but their imprint, a faint outline of lives that moved without needing to go anywhere. A silence that did not ask to be filled. What follows is not an observation, but a decision. The reason the chapter was removed, formally acknowledged, and replaced with a warning. Because at that point, containment became the only ethical option. Section 4. Why this chapter was removed. The official reason for the removal was never written as fear. It was written as precaution. The language used by the keepers avoided drama, avoided urgency, avoided condemnation. The chapter was described as incompatible, not dangerous, but incompatibility in this context was only a softer word for structural threat. What the chapter produced could not be regulated. It did not escalate visibly. It did not provoke rebellion. It did not fracture belief systems directly. It simply dissolved the internal pressure that made those systems functional. And when pressure disappears, structures do not collapse immediately. They become hollow. The keepers understood something crucial. A belief system can survive doubt. It can survive opposition. It can even survive contradiction. What it cannot survive is indifference that is not performative. Indifference without apathy. Silence without withdrawal, participation without internal investment. That is what this chapter created. The removal was not motivated by moral judgment. There was no claim that the mechanism was wrong, unethical, or corrupting. In fact, many who observed its effects acknowledged its precision. It produced stability. It reduced psychological friction. It eliminated compulsive behavior. By individual standards, it worked exceptionally well. By systemic standards, it was unusable. Systems require predictable engagement. They require measurable progress, visible striving, and recoverable motivation. The chapter produced people who still acted, but no longer reacted. And without reaction, feedback loops failed. Attempts were made to soften the chapter, to introduce interpretation, to reframe its effects as a temporary stage, to embed it inside broader narratives of development. None of these efforts worked. The moment the mechanism was named, it weakened. The moment it was contextualized, it disappeared. The chapter could not be taught safely, and it could not be modified without losing its effect. So the decision was not to revise it, but to extract it entirely. This extraction was not sudden. It occurred quietly over successive copies. Margins were shortened. References were removed. The chapter number was preserved for a time, but the text itself was replaced with warnings about imbalance, misuse, and premature exposure. Eventually, even the reference disappeared. What remained was a gap. Readers sensed it. The manuscript flowed too smoothly. The transition between sections felt unnaturally clean. Something had been removed that once disrupted continuity. The absence was not visible, but it was felt. This was intentional. The keepers believed that leaving a trace of absence was safer than leaving the content itself. Absence could be ignored. Presence could not. What they did not anticipate was that absence attracts attention. Those most sensitive to internal saturation noticed the gap, not intellectually. Somatically, the manuscript accelerated understanding, but never resolved it. It moved towards something that never arrived. That unresolved movement created pressure in those already exhausted by seeking. Eventually, fragments surfaced. Notes, marginal comments, partial copies preserved unintentionally, none of them complete, none of them explanatory, but enough to indicate that something had once existed there. The chapter was not destroyed because destruction creates myth. Myth creates pursuit. Pursuit reactivates desire. Desire was precisely what the mechanism dissolved, so the chapter was not erased. It was abandoned, left without lineage, without context, without protection. Those who encountered it afterward did so by accident, not initiation, which made the effects even harder to manage. This was when the warning replaced the chapter, not a warning about danger, a warning about irreversibility. The warning did not say, "Do not read." It said, "This cannot be undone." That language mattered, because what was at risk was not harm, but loss of orientation. The chapter did not break people. It removed the internal compass that pointed toward becoming, and without becoming, the manuscript had no function. So the chapter could not remain, not because it contradicted truth, but because it revealed a condition where truth no longer needed to be pursued, and pursuit was the foundation of everything that followed. Section 5. The internal difference. What separated this chapter from everything else was not its content, but its effect on the internal climate of those who encountered it. Other sections of the manuscript activated thought, curiosity, aspiration, or reflection. This fragment did something quieter. It altered the temperature of the inner world. Readers described a subtle but undeniable shift. Not insight, not understanding, a reduction. Internal noise diminished, mental urgency softened. The constant low-level tension that framed experience, the need to interpret, plan, evaluate, and narrate, thinned until it was no longer the default state. Nothing dramatic replaced it. There was no surge of peace, no emotional high, no sense of achievement. What appeared instead was an unfamiliar neutrality that did not ask to be maintained. It was not something the reader did. It was something that remained when effort stopped being necessary. This difference was deeply disorienting for those accustomed to internal motion. Most forms of guidance create direction. This chapter removed direction without creating confusion. The mind did not feel lost. It simply stopped scanning for the next step. That absence of scanning changed perception itself. Moments no longer felt like transitions between past and future. They became complete on their own, without commentary. Time did not slow in a mystical sense. It lost urgency. Minutes still passed, but they no longer pressed forward, demanding resolution. This internal difference made the chapter incompatible with every other section of the manuscript. The rest of the text depended on tension to function. Tension between lack and fulfillment, between question and answer, between effort and outcome. This chapter dissolved that tension without replacing it with doctrine or belief. Readers still remembered who they were. They did not lose memory or identity, but identity stopped narrating itself. The constant internal reinforcement of "this is me, this is where I am going, this is what this means," became unnecessary. Without that reinforcement, behavior changed in small, precise ways. Fewer unnecessary words, fewer rehearsed explanations, fewer justifications. Speech became functional, silence became sufficient. Emotion did not disappear, it became punctual. Feelings arose in response to actual events, not imagined futures. Anxiety lost its predictive role. Anticipation weakened. Regret shortened. Emotional states no longer lingered to shape identity. This was not emotional mastery, it was emotional economy. The internal difference also altered the relationship with choice. Decisions no longer required internal debate. Options appeared, and one was selected without narrative. The question was no longer, "What does this say about me?" but "Is this necessary now?" This frightened observers more than collapse would have. Collapse is visible. It demands intervention. This state did not. People still complied with social expectations when required, but without internal adhesion. They participated without belonging. They agreed without aligning. This made them difficult to influence and impossible to mobilize emotionally. The chapter did not create rebels. It created individuals who could not be recruited by urgency. Internally, this felt like relief without celebration. Externally, it appeared as disengagement without withdrawal. That combination had no existing category. Most troubling was how stable this internal difference proved to be. It did not fluctuate with mood. It did not disappear under stress. It did not require reinforcement. Once present, it simply remained. Attempts to reintroduce striving through comparison, stimulation, or fear produced brief reactions, but the internal system quickly returned to baseline neutrality. The pressure no longer found purchase. This is why the chapter could not remain part of a teaching manuscript. Teaching depends on desire. Desire depends on lack. This internal difference removed lack without promising fulfillment. A system cannot teach from a state that does not want to teach, and a reader who no longer needs to become something cannot be guided toward becoming. This is where the chapter diverged completely from everything else. Not in what it said, but in what it quietly removed. And removal, once complete, leaves no instructions for reversal. Section 6, the external illusion. What made this fragment survivable at all was disguise. Externally, it had to look like just another book, another manuscript, another contribution to a lineage of explanations. The illusion was not decorative, it was protective. Anything that does not announce its difference is tolerated longer. The chapter could not appear as rupture. If it did, it would attract resistance, debate, correction. So it was wrapped in familiarity. Same paper, same script, same cadence, same authority. Nothing about its form suggested that it functioned differently. This was intentional. The external structure reassured readers that they were still inside a system, still progressing, still learning, still moving forward. The internal effect told a different story. By the time the reader sensed the shift, the illusion had already done its work. This is why the fragment survives now only when presented as a complete book, not because it needs expansion, but because isolation requires camouflage. A single chapter marked as removed would be approached with expectation, tension, and desire. Desire would block the mechanism entirely. As a book, it passes unnoticed. Readers enter expecting accumulation, insight, revelation, something to add to themselves. That expectation dissolves gradually, without confrontation. The illusion holds until the internal pressure is already gone. This is the safest form of exposure. Externally, nothing seems unusual. A title, a cover, a beginning, an ending. The structure satisfies the part of the mind that tracks completion. Internally, however, nothing resolves, nothing culminates. The reading ends without a sense of arrival. That lack of arrival is not failure. It is the mechanism. Those who finished the fragment often reported confusion when asked what it was about, not because they didn't understand it, but because understanding was no longer the correct response. The book did not orient around meaning, it altered orientation itself. This made it impossible to summarize. Attempts to describe it to others sounded vague, incomplete, or evasive. Not because the reader withheld information, but because language depends on narrative pressure. Without that pressure, words lost their organizing function. This further protected the fragment. A thing that cannot be summarized does not spread efficiently. The external illusion also prevented premature containment. Authorities, scholars, and interpreters saw nothing overtly threatening. The text did not incite rebellion. It did not contradict doctrine directly. It did not propose alternative systems. It simply failed to motivate. Failure to motivate is rarely flagged as danger. So the fragment moved quietly. Those unaffected dismissed it as uneventful. Those affected could not explain why it mattered. The illusion held on both sides. This dual invisibility is why the fragment could not be destroyed. Destruction requires recognition. Recognition requires contrast. The fragment produced neither. It existed as something ordinary that caused something extraordinary only by subtraction. The illusion was not meant to deceive maliciously. It was meant to delay detection long enough for the internal effect to complete. Once completed, no external authority could reverse it. By the time someone realized that something had shifted, there was nothing to point to. No practice, no belief, no technique, no heresy. Only a reader who no longer needed to move in the same way. This is why the fragment must always look like just another book. Not because it is harmless, but because what it removes cannot be defended against once noticed. Section 7. The warning that replaced the chapter. What ultimately replaced the chapter was not an explanation nor a prohibition. It was a warning, short, neutral, almost administrative in tone. It did not describe the mechanism. It did not outline consequences. It simply stated that exposure to certain material could not be undone. The language mattered. Irreversible appeared more than once. Not as threat, but as fact. The keepers understood that fear would provoke curiosity, and curiosity would reactivate seeking. So the warning avoided emotion entirely. It did not say this would harm you. It said this would change how you move. It did not say this would cost you anything. It said something would no longer return. That subtlety was intentional. A warning framed around loss of innocence attracts little attention. People assume innocence is something they already lost. They underestimate what kind. The chapter had removed a specific form of innocence, the belief that movement is always necessary. The warning acknowledged this quietly, without emphasis. Those who read it did not stop. Those who ignored it would never understand it mattered. The warning functioned as a final containment layer. It did not block access. It shifted responsibility. From that point on, anyone who encountered the fragment could no longer claim they were unprepared. Not because they were fully informed, but because they were informed enough. The warning also served another purpose. It allowed the keepers to distance themselves from the effects without denying them. By stating irreversibility, they acknowledged reality without endorsing it. This preserved institutional neutrality. The wording avoided blame, it avoided instruction, it avoided invitation. It did not say, "Do not read." It did not say, "Proceed with caution." It said, in essence, what follows cannot be integrated back into the original structure. That phrase was deliberate. It implied that the problem was not danger, but incompatibility. Once internal pressure dissolved, reintegration into progressive systems became difficult, not impossible, difficult enough to matter. Those who read beyond the warning often forgot it immediately, not because it lacked clarity, but because clarity requires tension to hold attention. Without tension, memory does not anchor. Later, when changes appeared, the warning resurfaced without words. A vague recollection, a sense of having been told. That recollection carried no guilt, only recognition. This is how the warning did its work. It did not stop the mechanism, it prevented panic. Without the warning, those affected might have tried to fix themselves. They might have reintroduced urgency artificially. They might have sought restoration of desire. That effort would have created internal conflict. The warning reframed the experience as structural, not pathological. It said, quietly, "This is not something to solve." That sentence was never written, but it was understood. By replacing the chapter with a warning, the manuscript maintained continuity without reactivating the effect. Readers continued forward, unaware that something essential was missing. Those sensitive enough to notice absence already carried saturation. The warning did not activate the mechanism. It only named its permanence after the fact. This was the cleanest solution available, not deletion, not censorship, acknowledgement without elaboration. The chapter was gone. The effect remained possible. The warning stood as a marker for those who crossed unknowingly. What followed was silence. No further commentary was added, no revisions attempted. The manuscript continued as if uninterrupted. But for those who eventually encountered the fragment elsewhere, the warning made sense retroactively. It was not protection, it was orientation, and orientation, once internal pressure is gone, is all that remains. Section 8. If this chapter found you, it was not because you were searching for it. Search implies lack, and lack is loud. This fragment does not respond to noise. It appears only after saturation, when seeking has exhausted itself and no longer produces movement. People who encountered it were not beginners. They were not curious novices. They were not unformed minds. They were individuals who had already tried to improve themselves in every acceptable way. They had learned, they had practiced, they had refined, they had failed, they had succeeded. They had repeated the cycle until the internal effort began to collapse under its own weight. This chapter does not arrive at the beginning of a path. It arrives when paths stop working. If you are reading this, something in you has already recognized that acceleration, refinement, and correction have reached diminishing returns, not intellectually, somatically. The body knows first. Fatigue appears not from effort, but from repetition of effort that no longer changes anything. That is the signal. The fragment does not select based on worth, intelligence, or virtue. It appears when the internal system is no longer capable of sustaining the narrative of becoming, when improvement starts to feel artificial, when desire loses clarity, when motivation becomes performative. At that point, information designed to push forward becomes noise. What is required is subtraction. This is why the chapter does not explain itself. Explanation would reintroduce direction. Direction would reawaken striving. Striving would block the mechanism entirely. Instead, the chapter mirrors the reader's internal state. It does not guide, it reflects. The recognition is quiet. There is no moment of revelation, only a sense that something has been acknowledged without being named. Those who read it often say, later that it felt as if the text was not teaching them anything. This is accurate. Teaching implies addition. This fragment removes pressure that was already unsustainable. If this chapter found you, it is because the internal machinery that once responded to goals, visions, and urgency has already begun to fail. Not malfunction. Fail gracefully. It no longer produces meaning at the speed required to justify movement. The chapter does not fix this. It completes it. This is why it feels internally different. There is no hook that pulls you forward. There is no climax, no promise, no transformation arc. The absence of these elements is not oversight, it is alignment. Readers who are not ready experience boredom or confusion. They leave. Nothing happens. Readers who are ready do not feel excitement. They feel a loosening. Something releases its grip without announcement. That release cannot be forced. It cannot be rehearsed. It cannot be replicated intentionally. It occurs only when the internal system no longer benefits from maintaining tension. If this chapter found you, it means tension has already become inefficient. This is not an achievement. It is not a level reached. It is not progress. It is exhaustion of a particular mode of existence. The chapter does not tell you what to do next. That would recreate the problem. It simply removes the compulsion to ask. From the outside, nothing changes. From the inside, urgency no longer organizes perception. Life continues, but without the constant background noise of anticipation. This is why the chapter feels invisible. It does not announce its arrival. It does not leave evidence. It only becomes noticeable in hindsight, when you realize that something you used to carry is no longer there. If you are still reading, you are not waiting for instruction. You are recognizing a state, and recognition, once it happens, does not reverse. Section 9. What you lose after reading. What changes after reading this fragment is not what you gain, it is what quietly leaves. The first thing to go is urgency. Not the ability to act, but the pressure that insists action must always be happening. The internal clock that once pushed you forward loses its authority. Time still moves, but it no longer commands. You act when something is required, not when something is demanded by an imagined future. Soon after, the need to optimize begins to fade. Improvement remains possible, but improvement is no longer compulsive. You stop scanning yourself for flaws that must be corrected. The inner project of becoming better, wiser, more aligned, or more complete loses its momentum. Not because it failed, but because it finished what it could do. Along with optimization, comparison dissolves, not as a moral decision, but as a practical irrelevance. Other people's trajectories stop functioning as reference points. Their speed does not provoke anxiety. Their success does not demand response. Their failure does not reassure. They simply exist alongside you. Without pressure to measure yourself against them, you also lose the habit of narrating your life. Events still occur, but they no longer require interpretation. You stop asking what something means in the context of your story. The story itself becomes optional. This can feel disorienting at first, because narrative once provided continuity. Without it, life feels less dramatic and more exact. Another loss follows quietly, the desire to explain yourself. You still speak when necessary, but justification no longer feels essential. You stop translating your choices into language that others can approve of, not out of defiance, but because explanation no longer stabilizes anything internally. With explanation gone, identity thins. You do not lose memory of who you are. You lose the constant reinforcement of who you are supposed to be. Roles remain functional, but they no longer feel binding. You perform them without internal adhesion. This makes you less predictable, but more precise. What unsettles most people is the loss of fantasy. The imagined future that once pulled you forward loses its emotional charge. You can still envision possibilities, but they no longer promise salvation. Hope becomes unnecessary. Fear becomes inefficient. Motivation becomes situational. This loss is often mistaken for emptiness. It is not. Emptiness implies absence. What appears here is sufficiency without reward, a state where nothing is missing, but nothing is being chased either. You may notice that certain conversations become difficult to sustain, not because you disagree, but because the emotional fuel that once powered them is gone. Discussions about ambition, struggle, and destiny feel distant. You listen, but you are not pulled in. You also lose the impulse to seek confirmation. Praise lands and passes. Criticism registers and fades. Neither organizes behavior. This can feel isolating because social bonds often rely on shared reinforcement loops. Without them, relationships either simplify or drift. Perhaps the most significant loss is the belief that movement itself is virtuous. You no longer assume that doing more, becoming more, or accelerating is inherently good. Stillness is no longer suspicious. Pause does not need justification. Rest does not require reward. These losses are not dramatic. They do not arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly until one day you realize that the internal pressure you once lived under has been absent for some time. Nothing replaced it. And that is the point. This chapter does not leave you with a new system. It leaves you without the need for one. That absence is not a void to be filled. It is a space that does not ask for occupation. What you lose after reading cannot be recovered through effort. Trying to regain urgency feels artificial. Trying to recreate desire feels staged. The internal system recognizes the difference immediately. This is why the chapter does not warn you about loss. Loss implies deprivation. What disappears here was already exhausting you. The fragment does not take anything essential. It removes what was no longer functional. What remains is not enlightenment. It is alignment without narrative. Final section. This is where the chapter ends. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying more would undo what has already occurred. There is no final instruction, no practice to integrate, no insight to apply. Anything added here would reintroduce movement, and movement is what this fragment dissolves. If you are waiting for a conclusion, you have misunderstood the nature of what you just encountered. Conclusions belong to narratives. Narratives require tension. The absence of tension does not resolve, it simply remains. This chapter does not complete the manuscript. It removes itself from it. There is nothing to take forward, nothing to remember deliberately, nothing to protect. Whatever shifted did so without effort, and whatever did not shift was never meant to. Do not look for evidence. The effect leaves no markers. It appears only in what no longer pressures you, in what no longer demands urgency, in what no longer insists on becoming something else. If nothing changed, nothing was needed. If something changed, it will not ask for recognition. This is not a crossing that can be retraced, not because it is forbidden, but because there is nothing to return to. The internal machinery that once organized movement has already quieted, or it has not. Both outcomes are complete. You may close this book now, or leave it open. It makes no difference. The chapter does not follow you. It does not wait. It does not expect anything in return. It simply ends. And if you notice that something unnecessary has fallen away without effort, you will understand why this fragment could never remain inside a larger manuscript. Some things cannot be taught, they can only stop happening. Here, the chapter ends.